The morning rush at Rosalind's boutique, a high-end fashion store in one of the wealthiest districts of the city, was in full swing. Shoppers, clad in designer labels and wearing airbrushed smiles, drifted from one display to another, inspecting the curated racks of clothing that carried price tags as steep as a month's rent for most people. The scent of polished wood floors and luxury perfume filled the air, a hallmark of wealth and privilege. Amara Clark, one of the store's most trusted employees, worked quietly and efficiently in the background. At 29, she had already become one of the store's top performers, known for her impeccable customer service and her ability to read clients like a book. She loved fashion and had an eye for what would make a customer glow. Her deep brown skin contrasted against the pale cream of her uniform, and her braided hair was pulled into a neat bun, giving her a professional appearance that matched her thoughtful demeanor. But despite her hard work, Amara had learned early on that being one of the only black employees in a place like Rosalind's meant she was often under more scrutiny than others. She could feel eyes on her every time she moved through the store, whether it was the customers clutching their purses a little tighter when she passed, or the subtle glances from her manager, Brad, whose condescending tone never seemed to fully mask the prejudices that lived beneath it. Brad had been a source of quiet tension ever since Amara had started working there. He was in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of stiff, conservative posture that seemed to scream old school. Though he rarely said anything overtly offensive, Amara could feel it in the way he talked to her, his tone always slightly dismissive, as if he assumed she didn't fully belong. She had brushed it off for the most part, knowing it wasn't worth the fight. She needed this job, and she refused to let him diminish her. The day had started like any other, with Amara preparing the store for the flood of affluent customers who would soon be searching for the next big fashion statement. She rearranged some jewelry on a velvet display stand when she heard Brad's voice, loud and clipped, from the other side of the store. "Amara," he called out, "make sure the displays near the front are perfect. We've got a VIP shopper coming in later." "Yes, Brad," she replied without looking up, focusing on the bracelet she was setting just so. It was always her job to handle the front displays, even though several other employees were equally qualified to do it. But she knew why she was assigned these tasks. Brad wanted to make sure she was always visible, always within his line of sight. As she moved toward the front, she caught sight of Jessica, one of her co-workers, hovering near the perfume section, her gaze lingering on Amara a little too long. Jessica had been at Rosalind's for about 2 years, and although they had started as casual acquaintances, their relationship had become strained over time. Jessica, a petite blonde with a penchant for gossip, had always seen Amara as competition, though she never said it out loud. Amara's natural talent for connecting with customers, particularly the high-end clientele, had earned her praise from Rosalind's corporate office. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed to hover in the background, always eager to please, but never quite managing to stand out in the same way. Amara didn't mind at first. She kept her head down, focused on her work, and never let Jessica's subtle digs get to her. But recently, Jessica's attitude had shifted, becoming more pointed, more malicious. Amara had overheard her muttering complaints to Brad how Amara seemed to have all the luck with the best customers, or how people like her were getting more opportunities lately. Amara didn't respond to these barbs, but she knew what they meant. She was being singled out, quietly, in ways that weren't always easy to challenge. As Amara adjusted a pair of designer handbags, a wealthy older woman, dressed in pearls and clutching a small designer dog under her arm, approached her. The woman had that air of confidence that spoke of years of privilege. She barely glanced at Amara as she surveyed the bags. "I'm looking for something more." "Exclusive," the woman said, her eyes trailing over the bags without interest. Of course, Amara responded smoothly. She pulled out a limited edition handbag from behind the counter. This piece just arrived. Only a few were made. The woman's face lit up as she took the bag in her hands, turning it over to examine it closely. For a moment she seemed satisfied, before waving Amara off with a dismissive hand. "I'll think about it." "Hold it for me," she said, walking off toward the clothing section. Amara nodded, placing the bag back on display but keeping it in a prime spot for the customer to return. A few minutes later, Jessica sidled up beside Amara, her eyes flicking toward the bag. "Nice sale," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Must be nice getting all the high-profile customers." Amara knew the tone and undercurrent of resentment laced with jealousy. "I'm just doing my job, Jessica," she replied, "not taking the bait." Jessica shrugged, but her gaze lingered on Amara, a strange look of calculation in her eyes. "I guess we can't all be as lucky," she muttered before walking away. An hour later, chaos erupted in the store. The older woman had returned, her face flushed with anger as she stormed up to Brad, her dog yipping nervously under her arm. "My handbag. It's gone. I left it here, and now it's missing." Brad, ever the professional, immediately jumped into action. "Are you sure, Ma? I am? Did you leave it with one of our associates?" "Yes, that girl," the woman said, pointing directly at Amara. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Amara's breath caught in her throat as all eyes in the store turned toward her. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. She had placed the handbag exactly where it should have been. She knew she did. Brad's eyes narrowed as he glanced between the customer and Amara, suspicion already clouding his judgment. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," Amara began, her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. "I placed the bag on the display where you left it." "Well, it's not there now," the woman snapped, her voice rising, "and I want it back. Now." Brad stepped closer to Amara, his tone condescending and cold. "Amara, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. If the customer's item is missing, we need to know what happened." "I didn't take anything," Amara said, trying to remain calm despite the anger bubbling inside her. "It was right there on the display." Jessica appeared at Brad's side, her arms folded across her chest. "I don't know, Brad," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I saw Amara near that display earlier. She was acting a little strange." Amara's heart pounded. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." Brad held up his hand, silencing her. "Let's not jump to conclusions. But until we figure this out, I'm going to need you to come with me to the back." Amara's stomach dropped. She knew what this was. She had seen it before, heard the stories from friends and colleagues. It didn't matter that she had been a model employee. It didn't matter that she had never once been accused of wrongdoing in her life. All that mattered now was the color of her skin, the assumptions that people like Brad and Jessica made without even realizing it. Brad turned to one of the security guards standing nearby. "Get her to the back," he ordered. The guard, a burly man with a blank expression, stepped forward. Amara wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice of it all, but she knew that wouldn't help. She knew how situations like this could spiral out of control. Keeping her dignity intact was all she had left. Without a word, she allowed the guard to lead her through the store, past the curious eyes of the customers and her fellow employees. She kept her chin high, refusing to let them see her crumble. Behind her, she could hear Brad speaking to the customer, his voice low and soothing. "Don't worry, Ma, I am. We'll get to the bottom of this." As she walked, Amara felt a rush of emotions: anger, humiliation, and a deep, aching sense of betrayal. This was more than just a false accusation. This was about the years of quiet discrimination, the microaggressions, the unspoken but ever-present reminder that people like her were always being watched, always being doubted. In the back room, she was left alone, the door closed behind her. The cold, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the sterile white walls. Amara sat in the chair, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breath. She didn't know how long she waited, but it felt like an eternity before Brad entered the room, his expression unreadable. He took a seat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "Amara," he began, his tone cold and detached, "I need to ask you some questions. You understand why we're doing this, right?" Amara bit back the response that rose to her lips. Of course she understood. She understood all too well. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose her composure. "I didn't take anything, Brad," she said quietly. "I've worked here for years. You know me." Brad leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for a crack in her resolve. "I want to believe you, Amara, but we have a customer who's missing an expensive item, and you were the last person seen near it." Amara clenched her fists under the table. "Check the camera," she said. "You have security footage, don't you?" Brad's face darkened for a moment, but he nodded. We're looking into that. But until then, you'll stay here. The door opened again, and Jessica stepped in, her face a picture of concern. I just thought I should be here for support, she said, casting a sympathetic glance at Amara. Amara's jaw tightened. Jessica wasn't here to support her, she was here to watch the show. Brad turned to Jessica. Thanks, Jess, we're handling it. Jessica stayed, leaning against the wall, her eyes darting between Amara and Brad. Amara stared at the table, trying to block out the growing sense of dread that was creeping over her. She had done nothing wrong, but in this room, in this moment, it didn't matter. Amara sat in the cold, sterile room, the hum of the fluorescent lights a harsh reminder of the surreal nightmare she was now living. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, every minute that passed feeling like a new form of punishment. She wanted to believe this situation would be resolved quickly, that Brad would review the footage, realize the mistake, and apologize. But a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. Across the table, Brad sat with his arms folded, his face devoid of any empathy or warmth. Jessica lingered in the corner, watching with a mix of fake concern and thinly veiled satisfaction. Amara could feel her pulse in her ears, thudding like a drum, but she forced herself to stay composed. Breaking down or showing anger would only confirm their unfounded suspicions. So, Brad began, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying a false sense of calm authority. Why don't you tell me what happened with the handbag? Amara exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. I showed the customer the bag as she requested. She wasn't sure if she wanted it, so I placed it back on the display. I haven't touched it since. Brad nodded, as if he was trying to piece together a complicated puzzle, but Amara could see the suspicion still clouding his expression. And you're absolutely sure you didn't see anyone else around the display after that? Yes, Amara replied, her voice steady. I've been working the front section of the store all day, and I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. You can check the security footage if you don't believe me. Brad exchanged a glance with Jessica, who shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Amara knew the cameras would show the truth, but she also knew that in situations like these, the truth wasn't always enough to erase the damage already done. The door to the room opened suddenly, and the store's security officer, Officer Harris, entered. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a gruff demeanor and a stern expression that rarely softened. Behind him trailed two uniformed police officers, their faces unreadable but serious. The sight of them caused Amara's heart to skip a beat. This was becoming far more serious than she had anticipated. Brad stood and greeted the officers, shaking hands with them as if they were old friends. Thanks for coming down so quickly, he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of urgency. We have a situation here that we need to resolve. Amara watched the exchange, her stomach tightening further. The presence of the police made everything feel more real, more dangerous. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew how these situations could escalate. The stories she had heard from others about black men and women being falsely accused, harassed, or worse rushed through her mind like a flood. She felt the weight of their experiences bearing down on her shoulders. One of the officers, a younger man with sharp features, stepped forward. We were told a high-value item is missing, and that the employee here is a person of interest. His eyes briefly flicked toward Amara, but his expression gave nothing away. Brad nodded, gesturing toward Amara as if she were a mere object in the room. That's correct. The customer identified her as the last person who handled the item before it disappeared. Amara clenched her fists beneath the table, keeping her composure despite the wave of frustration that surged within her. I didn't take anything, she said firmly. I've been here the whole time. The item was left on display. Officer Harris, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped forward with a stern look on his face. We're going to need to search your belongings, Amara, just to clear things up. Amara's stomach dropped. She knew that this would be the next step, but the violation of it stung. The request wasn't made with respect, it was made with the presumption of guilt. Without protest, she nodded. I don't have anything to hide, she said, her voice steady though her chest tightened. The officers moved to her locker in the back, escorted by Brad. Amara sat frozen in her chair, her mind racing. She had nothing to hide, but the humiliation of having her personal belongings searched as though she were a criminal was almost too much to bear. The weight of every subtle act of discrimination she had faced in this store over the years bore down on her. In that moment, the quiet condescension from Brad, the jealous glares from Jessica, the cautious distance customers kept from her, despite her professionalism. This was what it had all led to: a cold, humiliating interrogation over a crime she hadn't committed. Jessica leaned against the wall, her eyes scanning Amara, as if waiting for her to crack under the pressure. "You know," Jessica began in a tone that was meant to seem friendly but was anything but. "If you just tell them what really happened, this could be over quickly. No one's judging you." Amara shot her a cold look, keeping her voice measured. "I didn't steal anything, Jessica, and you know it." Jessica feigned innocence, her eyes widening slightly. "I don't know anything, Amara. I just think it's strange that the bag disappeared when you were the last person to touch it." Before Amara could respond, the officers returned with Brad. They carried her personal belongings, which they laid out on the table. They rifled through her purse, checking every pocket and zipper. There was nothing to find, and Amara watched as their expressionless faces failed to register even the slightest hint of surprise when they confirmed what she already knew: there was no handbag, no stolen item. One of the officers looked up at Brad. "Her belongings are clear," he said simply. "There's no sign of the item here." Brad frowned, his frustration visible. "What about the footage? Have you checked the cameras?" Officer Harris nodded. "We'll review the footage, but based on this, it looks like there's no evidence of theft." Amara finally allowed herself a small breath of relief, but she knew it wasn't over yet. The damage had been done, the accusation already hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She would be guilty in Brad's eyes no matter what the footage showed. But at least the truth was beginning to surface. The officers left the room to review the surveillance tapes, leaving Amara alone once again with Brad and Jessica. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Brad crossed his arms, leaning against the wall as he glared at Amara. "We'll see what the footage says," he muttered, almost as if he was disappointed not to have found anything incriminating. Jessica, meanwhile, was still watching Amara closely, her lips curled in a smirk that barely hid her pleasure at the whole situation. Amara ignored her, focusing instead on keeping her composure. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Minutes passed like hours before the door opened again. Officer Harris stepped inside, his face grim but professional. "We reviewed the footage," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of tension. "It turns out the customer misplaced the item after all." Brad blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "The footage shows the customer placing the handbag down near the changing rooms," Harris continued. "Another customer picked it up and walked out of the store with it. It wasn't Amara at all." The relief that washed over Amara was immediate, but it was tainted with bitterness. She had known from the beginning that she was innocent, but to have her integrity questioned so publicly, so humiliatingly, it was something that wouldn't easily be forgotten. Brad's face flushed red with embarrassment, though his anger was still simmering just beneath the surface. "Well, that's unfortunate," he muttered, struggling to find the right words. He glanced at Amara but didn't apologize. He couldn't bring himself to admit he had been wrong, not openly. Jessica's smirk disappeared in an instant, replaced by a look of shock. She quickly tried to backtrack, her voice soft and false. "Oh, I didn't mean to accuse you of anything, Amara. I was just trying to help. You know how these situations can get out of hand." Amara stood, her body tense but her voice steady. "I know exactly how these situations get out of hand," she said, fixing Jessica with a pointed glare. She then turned to Brad. "I've worked here for years, Brad. You know me. You know my work ethic. And yet, the minute something goes wrong, I'm the first person you point to." Brad opened his mouth to speak, but Amara cut him off, her voice rising with the anger that had been building inside her for hours. "You didn't even question the idea that I might be innocent. You didn't wait for the facts. You just assumed." Officer Harris cleared his throat, cutting through the tension. "The important thing is that the matter has been resolved," he said diplomatically. "We've identified the real culprit, and there will be no further accusations." Amara gave him a small nod, grateful at least for his professionalism. But it wasn't enough to erase the bitterness of the day's events. She knew that walking out of that room without handcuffs didn't erase the harm that had been done to her dignity. "Amara," Brad said, his voice softer now, as though he were trying to recover some sense of control over the situation. "I think it's best we get back to work. There's no need to dwell on this. Let's just move forward." Amara stared at him, incredulous. "Move forward? You think I can just go back to work as if nothing happened?" Brad shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the backlash. "Look, I understand this was a misunderstanding, but—" "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Amara interrupted. "This was racial profiling, plain and simple. If I had been anyone else, you wouldn't have called the police so quickly. You wouldn't have assumed I was guilty before even checking the facts." The room fell silent. Jessica's eyes darted to the floor, and Brad's face flushed a deeper shade of red, but no one spoke. Amara took a deep breath, her mind made up. "I'll be taking the rest of the day off. And when I come back, we're going to have a serious conversation about how this store handles situations like these." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let this injustice slide. As she stepped back into the store, past the prying eyes of customers and employees alike, Amara held her head high. She had been falsely accused, humiliated, and treated like a criminal, but she hadn't let them break her. She had stood her ground, and now it was time to make sure that no one else had to go through what she had endured. The door to the store felt heavier than usual as Amara stepped outside, the crisp afternoon air hitting her face. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of everything that had just transpired. The humiliation, the anger, it all clung to her like a second skin. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. It was her best friend, Maya. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," Amara said, her voice still raw with emotion. "Girl, are you okay? I just saw a post about something going down at your store." Maya's voice was filled with concern, and Amara could hear the faint tapping of keys in the background. She was probably already halfway through typing out a social media post herself. Amara sighed. News traveled fast, especially in this part of town where everyone seemed to live their lives online. It wouldn't take long for the whole story to spread, for everyone to know what had happened to her. And while part of her cringed at the idea of being at the center of gossip, another part of her was grateful that at least the truth would be out there. "I'm fine," Amara replied, though her voice betrayed the emotional toll the day had taken. "But I was falsely accused of stealing. They called the police, Maya. They made me sit there like a criminal while they searched my stuff." Maya was silent for a beat, and Amara could almost feel her friend's anger brewing on the other end of the line. "They did what? I'm coming down there right now. This is ridiculous." Amara smiled a little at Maya's protective instincts, but she quickly shook her head. "No, it's fine. I'm already on my way out. I just need to clear my head." "What are you going to do?" Maya asked, her voice more measured now, though Amara could still hear the tension in it. "You're not just going to let them get away with this, are you?" Amara knew Maya was right. She couldn't let this go. If she didn't stand up for herself, they'd sweep the entire situation under the rug, just like they had probably done to others before her. She had heard stories, quiet murmurs of mistreatment, whispered in the back rooms by other black employees who were too scared to make waves. "I don't know yet," Amara admitted. "But I'm not going to let it slide. I've already decided that much." As she drove home, the events of the day played over and over in her mind. Every detail, every word exchanged, every glance. It was exhausting to think about how easily Brad and Jessica had turned on her, how quickly they had assumed the worst. But what hurt the most wasn't just the false accusation, it was the realization that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how competent she was, they had still seen her as guilty because of the color of her skin. When she got home, Amara collapsed onto her couch, letting the tension in her body ease just a little. But her mind kept racing. She knew she had to do something bigger than just demanding an apology. What had happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of systemic racism that permeated not only her workplace but countless others. She picked up her phone again, her fingers hovering over the contacts. With a deep breath, she dialed the number of her lawyer, Tanya Jackson, a fierce advocate for civil rights and someone Amara had met through a community outreach program. "Amara, hey, I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. What's going on?" Tanya's voice was warm, but there was an edge of curiosity. Amara quickly recounted the events of the day, sparing no detail. Tanya listened in silence, and when Amara finished, there was a pause on the other end. "This is serious," Tanya finally said, her voice firm. "They racially profiled you, called the police without cause, and humiliated you in front of your coworkers and customers. We can absolutely take legal action against them." Amara felt a small surge of relief, but there was also something else stirring inside her. "I want to do more than just file a lawsuit," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. If I just settle with them, they'll keep doing it. Nothing will change." Tanya was quiet for a moment, considering Amara's words. "We can go after more than just a settlement," she said after a pause. "We can push for changes at the corporate level. Mandatory bias training for all employees, a public apology, policy reforms. You can use this as leverage to make them confront their own systemic issues." Amara's chest tightened with the weight of the decision she was about to make. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, but now she realized she had an opportunity to use her voice for something bigger. She couldn't let this chance slip through her fingers. "I'm in," she said, determination filling her voice. "Let's do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with Tanya, gathering evidence and preparing for what would become a very public battle. Tanya had advised Amara to speak to the press, to get ahead of the narrative before Rosalind's could spin it in their favor. The story had already gained traction online, with customers and employees coming forward to express their outrage over what had happened. Some had even shared their own stories of discrimination, making it clear that Amara wasn't the first person to experience this kind of treatment. Amara decided to give an interview to a local news station. Sitting in front of the camera, she felt a rush of nerves, but she reminded herself why she was doing this. It wasn't just for her, it was for every person who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, like they were less than, because of the color of their skin. The interviewer, a kind woman in her early 40s, sat across from Amara, her expression sympathetic. "Amara, thank you for being here today. I know this must be difficult for you. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened?" Amara took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've worked at Rosalind's boutique for a few years now. I've always taken pride in my work, and I've always believed that if I worked hard enough, I'd be treated fairly. But a few days ago, I was accused of stealing an expensive handbag that a customer misplaced. My manager, without any evidence, called the police and had me detained in the back room while they searched my belongings." The interviewer nodded, her brow furrowed in concern. "How did that make you feel?" Amara hesitated, the weight of the question sinking in. "It made me feel like all the hard work I've done didn't matter. Like no matter what I do, no matter how good I am at my job, I'll always be seen as suspicious. And that's because I'm black. That's the reality I face every day, and it's a reality that so many people of color face in this country." There was a moment of silence as the words hung in the air, heavy with truth. "What do you hope will come from speaking out about this?" the interviewer asked. "I want change," Amara said firmly. "I want Rosalind's and other companies like it to take responsibility for the way they treat their employees of color. I want them to implement real policies that address racial bias and discrimination. I want them to acknowledge that this isn't just about one bad day, but about a system that's been in place for far too long." The interview aired that evening, and within hours it had gone viral. Social media lit up with posts supporting Amara, with people across the city and beyond sharing the hashtag #JusticeForAmara. Customers boycotted Rosalind's, demanding accountability. Former employees came forward, sharing their own stories of racial profiling and mistreatment. It wasn't long before the corporate office at Rosalind's boutique took notice. They released a statement, carefully crafted by their PR team, expressing regret over the incident and promising an internal investigation. But it wasn't enough. Amara, with Tanya's help, had already begun pushing for more. The legal proceedings moved forward, but so did the public pressure. News outlets covered the story, community leaders called for change, and even some of Rosalind's own employees voiced their support for Amara's demands. Weeks later, Amara found herself standing at a podium, speaking to a small crowd gathered outside the corporate offices of Rosalind's boutique. She had been invited to give a speech after the company agreed to several of her demands: mandatory racial bias training for all employees, a public apology, and policy changes aimed at preventing racial profiling in the future. As she stood there, looking out at the faces of those who had come to support her, Amara felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion. This fight had taken so much out of her, but it had also given her something in return: a sense of purpose, a determination to keep pushing for justice, not just for herself but for others who face similar battles. "Today is just the beginning," Amara said, her voice strong. "What happened to me could happen to anyone, and it has happened to so many. But we don't have to accept it. We don't have to stay silent. We can stand up and demand change, and together we can make sure that no one else has to go through what I did." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Amara allowed herself to smile. She had faced down injustice, and though the scars of that experience would stay with her, she had come out stronger on the other side. As she stepped down from the podium, Maya caught her in a tight hug. "You did it," Maya whispered. "You really did it." Amara nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "Yeah, we did." She had taken what was meant to break her and turned it into something powerful. She had fought for herself, for her dignity, and for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And in the end, she had won.